I still wake up some nights feeling that low rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines vibrating through my boots. It's a sound you never really lose, not even after 80 years. Most people think of the war as the mud of France or the cold of the Ardennes, and I saw plenty of that, God knows I did. But before any of that, there was the crossing. The North Atlantic in early 1944 wasn't just an ocean, it was a graveyard. We were packed onto those troop ships like cattle, thousands of us young boys from places like Nebraska and Ohio, staring out at a gray, churning wasteland of water that wanted to swallow us whole. We knew the U-boats were out there, the gray wolves, they called them. You'd stand on the deck at twilight, looking at the whitecaps, and every single one of them looked like a periscope for a split second. Your heart would jump into your throat and stay there. I remember sitting on a crate of ammunition near the stern, watching a destroyer escort about half a mile to our port side. It looked so small against those massive swells. That's where I met a man who changed how I thought about the whole war. His name was Elias Dutch Miller. He wasn't Army like me. He was a Navy Chief Petty Officer, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of old hickory and soaked in salt water. He was leaning against the railing, smoking a pipe that smelled like cherry tobacco and diesel fuel. He didn't look worried about the U-boats. He looked annoyed. I asked him once over the wind if he thought we'd make it. He just spat into the ocean and said the Navy brass was too busy reading manuals to notice the ocean was trying to kill us. I didn't know then that Dutch was carrying a secret. A piece of illegal hardware he'd built in a machine shop back in Norfolk that the top brass had forbidden him from using for 2 straight years. They told him his idea was a violation of protocol, a risk to the equipment, and a fantasy. But as I sat there, a 19-year-old kid terrified of a torpedo hitting us in the dark, Dutch just patted a heavy metal box bolted near the depth charge racks and winked. He told me that sometimes, to save lives, you have to break the rules that are meant to protect you. That box wasn't supposed to be there. If an admiral had seen it, Dutch would have been court-martialed before we hit the English Channel. But that little modification, that bit of backyard engineering, had already sent 7 German submarines to the bottom of the Atlantic without the Navy ever knowing how it happened. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The Navy had this rigid way of doing things. They had their ASDIC and their sonar, and they had these charts that told them exactly when to drop a depth charge based on the speed of the ship and the estimated depth of the sub. The problem was, the Germans weren't reading our manuals. They'd dive deep, or they'd sit in thermal layers where the sonar would bounce off the temperature change like it was hitting a brick wall. Our ships would be pinging away at nothing while the U-boat was actually 100 feet lower, laughing at us. Dutch had been a radio tech before the war, a real tinkerer. He'd figured out a way to tune the sonar signal, filtering out the ghost echoes from the thermal layers. He'd built a frequency stabilizer. That was the illegal mod. He called it the sieve. He'd presented it to the Bureau of Ships back in '42, and they laughed him out of the room. They said the current tech was the pinnacle of science, and a chief petty officer didn't have the theoretical background to improve it. They officially banned any unauthorized modifications to sonar arrays, citing security risks. But Dutch knew better. He'd seen too many tankers go up in flames. So he built a portable version, something he could bridge into the circuit when the officers weren't looking. We spent hours talking on that deck. I was just an infantryman, but I liked the way he talked about the machinery. It felt grounded, unlike the speeches the colonels gave us about glory. Dutch talked about vacuum tubes and copper wiring. He told me about the first time he used the sieve. It was a month after the ban. His ship, a destroyer called the Mullany, was escorting a slow-moving convoy. They picked up a faint contact, but the official sonar was giving a scattered reading, meaning the sub was hiding in a warm current. The captain was about to call off the search, thinking it was a school of fish. Dutch waited until the sonar operator went to get coffee, swapped his mod into the line, and the signal turned from a blurry mess into a sharp, piercing spike. He didn't tell the captain he'd modified the gear. He just shouted that he had a solid lock. They dropped a pattern of 6 charges. 5 minutes later, the ocean vomited up diesel oil, bits of cork, and a German sailor's cap. That was number 1. Dutch just went back to his bunk and updated his private log. He never claimed the kill for his invention. He let the captain take the credit for superior intuition. By the time I met him on that troop ship, he'd done it 6 more times on different vessels, always moving his little black box from ship to ship like a piece of contraband. He told me that the hardest part wasn't the Germans. It was keeping the officers from finding out he was making them look good. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. 3 days into our crossing, the weather turned. The Atlantic became a wall of black water and white spray. You couldn't stand on the deck without holding a lifeline. Down in the hold, the smell was unbearable. Sweat, vomit, and the damp wool of 3,000 uniforms. I couldn't take it. I crawled back up to the topside, huddling near the superstructure just to breathe. I saw Dutch there, drenched to the bone, staring at the screen of a portable monitor he'd rigged up. He looked pale. He told me to get below, but I stayed. I asked him what he saw. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he whispered that the convoy was being trailed, not by one sub, but by 3. The official sonar on our escort ships was struggling because of the storm. The turbulence was creating too much clutter on their screens. To them, the ocean was just noise. But Dutch had his SEV running. He showed me the screen. It was just a tiny green cathode ray tube, and I saw them. 3 distinct, steady pulses. They were sitting right behind us, waiting for the moon to break through the clouds so they could surface and start the slaughter. Dutch knew he was in a corner. If he didn't say anything, we might all die. If he did say something, he'd have to explain how he was seeing things the fleet's best equipment couldn't. He looked at me and said, "Lawson, if I don't do this, you're never going to see Normandy. You're just going to be another name on a memorial." He grabbed a handheld radio and called the bridge of the nearest destroyer escort. He didn't use his name. He used a specific frequency he knew the radio operators used for informal chatter. He told them exactly where to drop the charges, disguised as a coordinated sonar burst from the troop ship's own auxiliary gear. It was a lie, but it was a calculated one. 10 minutes later, the world exploded. I'd never felt anything like it. A depth charge isn't just a bang. It's a physical blow to the chest, even from a distance. The water rose up in massive white columns that seemed to touch the sky. The ship shuddered so hard, I thought the rivets would pop. In the chaos, no one noticed Dutch unhooking his black box and sliding it under his coat. One of the U-boats was forced to the surface, its hull buckled. Our escort ships turned their 5-inch guns on it and finished it off in minutes. The other 2 subs, seeing their brother destroyed by a blind convoy in a storm, turned tail and dove deep. They didn't know how we'd found them. Neither did the admiral, who later wrote a report praising the extraordinary luck and vigilance of the convoy escorts. Dutch just sat there in the rain, relighting his pipe. "That was number 8, he told me. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten." We reached Liverpool a week later. I remember the feeling of solid ground under my feet. I wanted to kiss the dirt. Dutch was there on the pier, tossing his sea bag over his shoulder. He looked like any other tired sailor, but I knew he was carrying the reason I was still breathing. We shared a final smoke before my unit moved out toward the staging areas for the invasion. I asked him if he was ever going to tell them. He looked at the little black box tucked into the side pocket of his bag and shook his head. He said that if he told them, they'd spend 2 years testing it, 3 years debating the budget, and by the time they issued it to the fleet, the war would be over and millions would be dead. He told me, "Sometimes, kid, the only way to do the right thing is to do it in the dark." I never saw Dutch again. I went through the hedgerows, I saw the liberation of Paris, and I froze in the snow of the Bulge. But I often thought about that sailor and his illegal mod. It taught me a lesson I carried through the rest of the war. The people at the top have the maps, but the people at the bottom have the truth. They tell you the equipment is perfect because it's expensive. They tell you the plan is flawless because they wrote it. But the guy in the foxhole or the engine room knows where the cracks are. I spent my time in the infantry fixing my own gear, filing down firing pins that were too long, or acquiring extra socks, even when the supply sergeant said we didn't need them. I survived because I learned from Dutch that survival isn't about following every line in the manual. It's about knowing which lines were written by someone who's never been shot at. Years later, after the war, I read an article in a technical journal. It was 1948. The Navy was announcing a revolutionary new breakthrough in sonar technology that used frequency stabilization to filter out thermal clutter. They called it a miracle of modern engineering. They gave medals to a couple of engineers in white coats who had discovered the principle in a lab. I sat in my living room in Ohio and laughed until I cried. They finally realized it, 2 years after the war ended, and 4 years after Dutch had already proven it worked on the back of a troop ship in a hurricane. I wonder if they ever found his private logs. Probably not. Men like Dutch don't look for credit. They just look for results. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 now, and my memory isn't what it used to be. I forget where I put my glasses, and I forget what I had for breakfast. But I can still see the look on Dutch's face when that U-boat surfaced in the middle of the Atlantic. It was a look of quiet, grim satisfaction. He didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He just knew he'd done his job. I'm telling this story now because people need to know that history isn't just made by the generals whose names are in the textbooks. It's made by the guys who see a problem and fix it, even when they're told not to. It's made by the illegal ideas that actually work. I've spent 80 years wondering how many other Dutches were out there. How many soldiers modified their rifles to keep them from jamming in the mud? How many pilots tweaked their engines to get an extra 5 miles an hour? We were an army of tinkerers, an army of guys from farms and garages who didn't trust the brass as far as we could throw them. That's why we won. The Germans followed orders to the letter. We followed orders until they didn't make sense, and then we did what needed to be done. I still have a small piece of copper wire in my junk drawer in the kitchen. My daughter asks me why I keep it. I tell her it's a reminder. It's a reminder that a little bit of wire and a lot of guts can change the world. I don't know where Elias Miller is buried or if he's even gone yet. But if there's an afterlife, I bet he's up there right now, looking at the gates of heaven and telling St. Peter that the hinges are all wrong and he knows a way to make them swing smoother if they'll just let him get his tools. He saved my life, and he saved the lives of thousands of other boys who never even knew his name. That's the real story of the war. It's the story of the things the Navy banned and the men who used them anyway. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Looking back, it's funny how the things that haunt you aren't always the tragedies. Sometimes it's the what-ifs. What if Dutch had listened to the officers? What if he'd been a good sailor and left that box in the trash back in Norfolk? I wouldn't be sitting here. I wouldn't have children or grandchildren. A whole branch of a family tree would have been lopped off in the middle of the ocean, and no one would have even known why. Just another missing at sea report delivered to a porch in a small town. The war was full of those moments, thin lines between existence and nothingness. We like to think we're in control, but we're all just riding on ships we didn't build, hoping someone like Dutch is on board. It makes you humble. It makes you realize that the world is held together by invisible threads of common sense and rebellion. I'm an old man, and I've seen the world change in ways I never thought possible. We have computers in our pockets now that have more power than all the gear on that troop ship combined. But I still believe that if you put a human being in a desperate situation, they'll find a way to break the rules to survive, and they should. Because the rules are usually written by people who aren't in the room when the shooting starts. I hope someone hears this and remembers that. Don't be afraid to be the one with the illegal idea if you know it's the one that's going to save the day. The brass will catch up eventually. They always do. It just takes them a few years and a lot of meetings to admit that the guy in the engine room was right all along. I'm tired now. It's late, and the house is quiet. But in the silence, I can still hear that sonar ping. Ping, ping, clear and sharp, like a heartbeat. It's a good sound. It means we're still here. It means the sieve is still working. The rain in England didn't feel like rain back home. It was a persistent, bone-chilling mist that seemed to soak through everything. Your jacket, your skin, even your thoughts. We were stationed near a village whose name I can't quite recall now, just a cluster of stone houses and muddy lanes. We spent those weeks waiting for the word, the big go. We spent our days cleaning rifles that were already spotless and hiking through the countryside with packs that felt like they were filled with lead. Every time I looked at my gear, I thought about Dutch and that black box of his. It changed something in me. I started looking at my M1 Garand not as a sacred object from the armory, but as a tool that had flaws. A guy in our platoon, a wiry kid named Miller, no relation to Dutch, had been a watchmaker in civilian life. He noticed that the clips on some of our rifles were catching on the internal springs, just a fraction of a millimeter, but enough to cause a jam when you needed a second shot. The official word from the sergeants was, "Keep it oiled and shut up." But Miller didn't shut up. He spent his nights with a tiny file, working on every man's rifle in our squad, smoothing out the rough edges the factory had left behind. It was unauthorized. If the CO had seen us, we'd have been doing laps until our boots fell off. But when we finally hit the beach and the sand started getting into the mechanisms, our squad's rifles kept singing while other units were struggling with stuck bolts. That's the kind of thing you don't find in the history books. They talk about the grand maneuvers of the divisions, but the war was won in the millimeters. It was won by the watchmakers and the radio techs who knew more than the guys who designed the stuff. I remember sitting under a tarp one night, the sound of the rain drumming overhead, talking to Miller about Dutch. I told him about the U-boat and the sieve. Miller just nodded, his eyes focused on the tiny metal part in his hand. He said, "The people who build these things don't have to use them. That's the problem, Henry. They build for the average, but the average gets you killed out here." That stuck with me. We were all being prepared to be part of a massive machine, a force of nature that was supposed to steamroll across Europe. But the more I saw, the more I realized the machine was held together by chewing gum and the ingenuity of kids who had spent their childhoods fixing Ford Model Ts. We weren't just soldiers, we were mechanics of survival. I kept thinking about those 7 U-boats Dutch had taken out. 7 ships, hundreds of men on the German side, all gone because one man decided that the manual was wrong. It was a heavy thought. It made you realize that one person standing in the right place with the right idea could tilt the scales of the entire world. And yet, that person would likely never get a parade. They'd just get a reprimand if they were caught. The nights in the camps were the hardest. You had too much time to think. We'd sit around these small stoves, the light flickering off the canvas walls of the tents, and we'd talk about what we were going to do when it was over. Some guys wanted to go back to the farm, others wanted to use the GI Bill to become doctors or lawyers. I just wanted to see a sunset that didn't feel like a countdown. There was a corporal in the tent next to mine, a guy named Henderson who'd been in the North Africa campaign. He had these 1,000-yard stare eyes that made you feel like he was looking through you at something 100 miles away. He told me once that the most dangerous thing you could carry into battle wasn't a faulty rifle. It was a blind belief that the plan was going to work. He'd seen plans fall apart in the desert sun, and he'd seen men die holding onto orders that had been obsolete for hours. He'd done his own illegal mods too, though his were more about tactics. He'd learned to ignore the official handbook on how to approach a machine gun nest. He'd figured out that if you moved in a certain jagged rhythm, the German gunners, who were trained to lead their targets based on a steady pace, would overshoot every time. He tried to teach us that, but the lieutenants didn't want to hear it. They wanted us in neat lines, moving by the book. It was frustrating, seeing the gap between the reality of the dirt and the theory of the map. I kept wondering if Dutch was still out there on the Atlantic, peering at his little green screen, seeing the things that weren't supposed to be there. I wondered if he ever felt lonely, being the only one who knew the truth while the rest of the Navy sailed on, blissful in their ignorance. It's a burden, knowing something that the authorities refuse to acknowledge. It makes you feel like you're living in 2 worlds at once. One world where everything is orderly and follows the rules, and another world where the rules are just a polite suggestion that the ocean or the enemy is about to ignore. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When June finally came, the tension was so thick you could almost taste it. It tasted like cold grease and nervous sweat. We were moved to the embarkation points, and that's when the scale of it really hit me. Thousands upon thousands of ships. The horizon was nothing but steel. I looked for Dutch's ship, but of course I had no way of finding it. I just hoped he was somewhere in that massive armada, his black box tuned to the frequency of survival. The crossing back across the channel was nothing like the Atlantic crossing. This was short, violent, and loud. The sky was filled with the roar of planes, a sound so constant it became a part of your heartbeat. I remember standing on the deck of the Higgins boat, the ramp vibrating against the waves, and thinking about the sieve one last time. I realized then that Dutch hadn't just built a sonar mod. He'd built a way to see through the fog of war. And as that ramp dropped and the first burst of machine gun fire whistled over our heads, I knew that I had to do the same. I had to see the world as it was, not as I was told it would be. The water was freezing. It was deeper than they told us. Men were weighed down by all that official gear, the extra ammo, the gas masks they told us we'd need but never did, the heavy shovels. A lot of boys drowned because they were too afraid to drop the gear they were ordered to carry. I saw one kid, no older than 18, struggling to stay afloat, his eyes wide with terror. I yelled at him to cut his pack, but he wouldn't. He'd been told that losing your equipment was a court-martial offense. He went under because he followed the rules. I reached down and unbuckled my own heavy pack, letting it sink into the surf. I kept my rifle and my ammo, but the rest of it, the stuff the brass insisted was vital, went to the bottom. I chose to live. I think Dutch would have approved. That day on the beach was a blur of gray smoke and red water. You don't remember it as a story. You remember it as a series of flashes. The smell of burnt cordite, the way the sand felt like needles against your face, the sound of a man calling for his mother 2 feet away from you while you couldn't do a damn thing to help him. It was chaos, and in that chaos, the manuals were useless. The only thing that mattered was the man to your left and the man to your right, and whether or not you could find a way to make it to the seawall. We spent the next few days in the hedgerows. If you've never seen a Normandy hedgerow, you can't imagine it. They aren't just bushes. They're ancient walls of earth and tangled roots, 6 feet thick and 10 feet high. The Germans had been there for years, carving out bunkers and tunnels inside them. Our tanks couldn't get through. They'd try to climb over, exposing their thin belly armor to the German anti-tank guns, and they'd get brewed up in seconds. We were stalled. The great Allied machine was being stopped by some dirt and some trees. And once again, the solution didn't come from the generals. It came from a guy named Curtis Cullen, a sergeant from an armored unit who'd been a cab driver or something back in New York. He took some steel beams from the German beach obstacles, the Czech hedgehogs, and welded them to the front of a Sherman tank like giant teeth. He called it the Rhino. The brass initially told him he was ruining the tanks, that it wasn't an authorized modification and would mess with the weight distribution. But Cullen didn't care. He drove that tank right through a hedgerow, slicing through the roots like a hot knife through butter. Suddenly, we were moving again. I saw one of those Rhino tanks go past our position, and I cheered until my throat was raw. It was Dutch all over again. It was the illegal mod that saved the day while the high-ranking officers were still back in England trying to figure out a strategic solution. It makes you wonder how much shorter the war would have been if they'd just listened to the guys on the ground from day one. But that's not how the world works, I suppose. The world likes its hierarchies, it likes its medals, and its polished boots. It doesn't like the guy with a welding torch or a soldering iron who points out that the emperor has no clothes, or that the Navy's sonar is blind. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. By the time we were pushing toward the French interior, the news of the sonar breakthrough hadn't reached us, of course. We were just living day to day. But I'll never forget a conversation I had with a captured German officer near St. Lo. He was a submariner, a guy who'd been transferred to the infantry because they were running out of boats. We were sitting in a ruined farmhouse, waiting for the rain to stop so we could move him to the rear. I asked him, through a translator, what it was like out there in the Atlantic. He looked at me with these hollow, tired eyes and said that for a long time, they felt like they were ghosts. They could go anywhere, do anything, and the Americans would never see them. But then, he said, something changed. Around early '44, they started losing boats they shouldn't have lost. They'd be in a storm or deep in a thermal layer, places where they were supposed to be invisible, and suddenly the depth charges would start falling right on top of them. He said the survivors talked about a demon sonar the Americans had developed. Their commanders told them it was impossible, that the physics didn't allow for it, but the men in the boats knew. They knew the Americans had found a way to see through the dark. I sat there, listening to him, and I felt this incredible sense of pride. I didn't tell him about Dutch. I didn't tell him about the black box. I just nodded and said, yeah, we've got some pretty smart guys. It was a strange moment of connection. Two enemies, both realizing that the war was being decided by things their superiors didn't even understand. That German officer was terrified of the tech, but I was just grateful for the man. I thought about the families of those 7 U-boat crews, and then I thought about the thousands of American mothers whose sons made it to France because of what Dutch did. The math of war is cold and it's cruel, but if you have to choose a side, you choose the one that brings your boys home. The war dragged on. It got colder. The mud turned to ice, and the ice turned to blood. I saw things I don't like to talk about, things that don't fit into a story about clever inventions and brave sailors. I saw the way a person can just disappear in a puff of smoke. I saw the way a town that had stood for 500 years could be reduced to rubble in 5 minutes. You start to lose your sense of self out there. You become a serial number, a cog in that big machine I mentioned. But I always kept that lesson from Dutch close to my chest. Whenever I was given an order that seemed suicidal or just plain stupid, I looked for the sieve. I looked for the way to tune out the noise and find the truth of the situation. Sometimes that meant taking a different path through a woods, even if it wasn't the one on the map. Sometimes it meant trusting my gut over the word of a lieutenant who had only been in the country for 3 days. It's what kept me alive. It's what kept me from becoming a name on a white cross in a field in Belgium. When the war finally ended and we were sitting in a tavern in a small German town, drinking beer that tasted like victory and relief, I took a moment to toast the tinkerers. I toasted Dutch Miller and Curtis Cullen and the watchmaker Miller. I toasted the men who weren't afraid to be wrong in the eyes of the law so they could be right in the eyes of God. We're all gone now, or nearly all gone. Most of those men took their secrets to the grave. They didn't feel the need to brag. They just did what they did because it was the only way to get the job done. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember when I finally got home. My mother was crying, and my father just kept shaking my hand like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. It was 1946. I tried to go back to a normal life, working in a factory, getting married, having kids. But I'd always look at things and see how they could be better. I'd see a machine on the assembly line and think, if you just moved that lever 2 inches to the left, it wouldn't jam so much. I became known as a bit of a troublemaker at work because I was always suggesting changes to the official way of doing things. My boss would tell me, "Lawson, the engineers in Detroit designed this. Who are you to tell them how it works?" I'd just smile and keep my mouth shut, but I'd make the change anyway when he wasn't looking. And wouldn't you know it, my line always had the highest production numbers. It's a certain way of looking at the world, I guess. You realize that official is often just a synonym for complacent. And complacency is what kills you, whether it's on a troop ship in the Atlantic or on a shop floor in Dayton. I never did find out what happened to that black box. I imagine Dutch probably threw it into the harbor when he finally retired, or maybe it's sitting in some dusty attic in Virginia, looking like nothing more than a heap of old radio parts. But to me, that box was the most important piece of technology in the whole damn war. It wasn't the atomic bomb or the B-29. It was a humble little mod built by a guy who cared more about his fellow sailors than he did about his career. That's why I'm telling this now. I'm 92, and I don't have much time left to set the record straight. I want people to know that the illegal mod wasn't just a story about a sonar unit. It was a story about the American spirit. It was about that stubborn, beautiful refusal to accept that things can't be better. We've lost a bit of that, I think. We've become a world of people who just follow the prompts and read the manuals. We've forgotten how to tinker. We've forgotten how to be Dutch. I hope that somewhere, there's a young person listening to this who's being told that their idea is unauthorized or against protocol. I hope they think about that chief petty officer on the deck of a destroyer, looking out at a storm and deciding that he was going to save some lives. Rules be damned. I hope they have the courage to build their own sieve, because the world is always going to be full of U-boats, and the official sonar is always going to have its blind spots. You've got to be the one to find the signal in the noise. It's the only way to make it home. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I think back to the end of that article I read in 1948, the one where the Navy took credit for the frequency stabilization. They had a quote from an admiral talking about how the disciplined application of scientific principles by the naval hierarchy has ensured our continued dominance of the seas. I remember spitting on the floor when I read that. Disciplined application. They had the solution sitting in their lap for 2 years, and they were too arrogant to see it. It makes you wonder how many other miracles are just stolen ideas from guys who were told to shut up. But I guess that's the way of the world. The lions take the meat, and the jackals take the credit. But the guys like Dutch, they don't care about the meat or the credit. They just care that the ship didn't sink. I've lived a long life, a good life. I've seen my children grow up and my grandchildren start their own lives. I've seen men walk on the moon, and I've seen the world get smaller and faster. But nothing has ever been as real to me as that night in the Atlantic. with the spray in my face and the sound of the depth charges calling out into the deep. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. And the truth was that we were alive because a man broke the rules. That's a powerful thing to carry for 80 years. It's a weight, but it's a good weight. It reminds you that you're here for a reason. And maybe my reason is just to tell this story, so that Dutch Miller's illegal legacy doesn't vanish with The Last of Us. Maybe that's enough. After we left France and started pushing toward the German border, the war changed again. It wasn't about the speed of the breakout anymore. It became a slow, grinding crawl through some of the most unforgiving terrain I've ever seen. We hit the Siegfried Line, a massive belt of fortifications that the Germans called the West Wall. It was miles of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth tank obstacles, and minefields that seemed to cover every square inch of the earth. The air turned bitter. By the time we were looking at the dark silhouette of the Hurtgen forest, the rain had turned to a slushy, freezing sleet that never seemed to stop. I remember huddling in a shallow foxhole, trying to keep my feet from freezing, and my mind kept drifting back to the Mulaney and Dutch Miller. I wondered where he was. Probably somewhere warmer, though the North Atlantic in winter isn't exactly a tropical vacation. But what I really thought about was the noise. In the Hurtgen, the noise wasn't just the sound of the shells. It was the visual clutter of the trees. Everything looked like a threat. Every shadow was a sniper. Every fallen log was a machine gun. Our commanders were following maps that were 20 years old, ordering us into sectors that didn't exist anymore because the artillery had leveled everything. We were blind, just like those destroyer escorts had been blind in the Atlantic storms. I realized then that the sieve wasn't just a piece of electronics, it was a philosophy. It was the ability to filter out the nonsense, the outdated orders, the rigid expectations, the official way of doing things, and focus on the one thing that mattered, staying alive and moving forward. I saw a sergeant in a neighboring company, a guy we called Pop, because he was all of 35 years old, who had his own version of a sieve. The Army issued us these heavy, wool-lined overcoats that were great for a parade in Washington, but terrible for a muddy forest. When they got wet, they weighed 40 pounds and sucked the heat right out of your body. Pop took a pair of shears and cut his coat off at the waist, then used extra canvas from a truck cover to line the inside of his jacket. He looked like a hobo, and the captain gave him hell for destroying government property. But Pop didn't get trench foot, and he didn't freeze. Pretty soon, half the company was destroying their coats too. It was an illegal modification of the uniform, but it was the difference between being a casualty and being a soldier. I think Dutch would have laughed if he'd seen us. We were all becoming mechanics of our own survival. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There was one night in November, just before the real snow started to fall. We were pinned down near a ridge, and the German mortars were bracketed right on our position. They had a spotter somewhere who could see every move we made. We were losing men every hour, and the official response was to wait for an airstrike that we knew wasn't coming because the clouds were touching the treetops. I was sitting there, chewing on a piece of cold K ration, when I saw a kid from the Signal Corps named Bernie crawling through the mud. He was dragging a reel of telephone wire and had a strange-looking contraption strapped to his chest. It looked like a field radio, but he'd stripped the casing off and replaced some of the dials with parts he'd scavenged from a captured German scout car. I asked him what he was doing, and he whispered that he was tuning into the frequency of the shells. He'd figured out that the German mortar teams were using a specific radio frequency to coordinate their fire with the spotter. He wasn't supposed to be listening to them. He was supposed to be keeping our own lines open. But Bernie had built a bridge in his radio, another illegal mod, that let him intercept their coordinates. He sat there in the mud, with shells exploding 50 yards away, calmly writing down the numbers he was hearing. He didn't tell the lieutenant. He knew the lieutenant would tell him to stick to the manual. Instead, Bernie crawled over to an artillery sergeant he knew and whispered the numbers into his ear. 5 minutes later, our big guns opened up. They didn't hit the ridge. They hit a small stone hut about 2 miles back that wasn't even on our target list. The mortars stopped instantly. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Bernie just packed up his radio and disappeared back into the fog. He never got a medal for that. In fact, if the Signal Corps found out he'd messed with the internal wiring of a standard issue SCR 300, they probably would have docked his pay or worse. But he saved our company that night. He used his own sieve to find the signal in the noise. I sat there in the dark, thinking about Dutch again. I wondered how many hundreds of illegal acts of genius were happening every single day across the front. We were an army of individuals, of tinkerers and rebels, and that's why the Germans couldn't stop us. They were waiting for orders from a guy in a bunker in Berlin. We were taking advice from a kid with a modified radio in a ditch. The Hurtgen forest was where I truly understood what Dutch meant when he said the Navy brass was too busy reading manuals to notice the ocean was trying to kill them. In the forest, the Army brass was too busy looking at strategic objectives to notice that the terrain was eating us alive. They sent us into those woods because the map said it was the shortest route. They didn't listen to the scouts who said the ground was a swamp and the trees were a death trap. I remember seeing a colonel come down to the front lines once, a rare sight. He was wearing a clean uniform and looking at a clipboard. He asked a private why he wasn't carrying his gas mask. The private, who had been in the line for 3 weeks and lost half his squad, just looked at the colonel and said, "Sir, if the Germans start using gas, I'll be glad to die, because it'll mean I don't have to sleep in this hole anymore." The colonel was outraged. He started talking about discipline and regulations. He didn't see the man. He saw a violation of the code. That was the Navy's problem with Dutch, too. They didn't care that he was sinking U-boats. They cared that he didn't have the theoretical background to be right. It's a dangerous thing, being right when the people in charge are wrong. It makes you a target. I spent the rest of my life watching out for that. In the corporate world, in the factory, even in the local VFW. There's always someone with a clipboard who'd rather see the ship sink than see a sailor fix it without permission. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. One of the things that stays with me, even now at 92, is the smell of the diesel and the salt from Dutch's pipe. It's funny how a smell can trigger a memory more clearly than a photograph. I can close my eyes and be back on that troop ship, feeling the vibration of the engine and the spray of the Atlantic. I can see Dutch's hands, greasy, calloused, but incredibly steady as he worked on his black box. He told me once that the Navy had officially tested a device similar to his in 1942 and found it unreliable. He laughed when he told me that. He said they tested it in a calm bay in Maryland with a bunch of technicians who'd never been on a pitching deck in their lives. They didn't understand that a machine has to have a soul. You have to know its quirks. You have to know how it reacts when the power fluctuates or when the salt air starts to corrode the terminals. Dutch didn't just build a device, he built a relationship with the technology. He'd spend his own money, precious dollars from his meager paycheck, to buy better vacuum tubes from civilian shops in whatever port they hit. He was subsidizing the United States Navy out of his own pocket just to keep us from getting blown out of the water. And they repaid him by threatening him with a court-martial if they ever caught him using it. It makes you wonder how much progress is held back by that kind of institutional arrogance. How many cures for diseases, how many inventions that could save the planet are currently sitting in some kid's garage because a bureau of ships somewhere told them they didn't have the right credentials? It's a recurring theme in human history. The experts are always the last ones to know when the world has changed. By December, we were in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. That's where the noise became deafening. The Germans threw everything they had left at us. It was a desperate, bloody mess. I remember being trapped in a small village called Foy near Bastogne. The fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We were surrounded, low on ammo, and freezing to death. I found myself thinking about Dutch's sieve every single hour. I needed a way to see through that fog. I remember watching a tank commander, a guy whose Sherman had been disabled, scrounging parts from a wrecked German Panther. He was trying to rig up a way to use the Panther's infrared night vision scope, a piece of gear that was way ahead of anything we had. Our officers told him to leave it alone, that enemy technology is a trap. But this guy, he didn't listen. He spent all night in the freezing cold, adapting the German power supply to work with a US battery. The next night, when the Germans tried to sneak a patrol into our lines under the cover of the fog, that tank commander saw them coming from 200 yards away. He opened up with a 50 cal and turned their surprise into a retreat. Another illegal mod, another life saved. I started to see the whole war as a collection of these moments. Thousands of little rebellions against the official way of doing things. We weren't just fighting the Germans, we were fighting the stagnation of our own system. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I think about the 7 U-boats that Dutch sank. Those were 7 crews that never went home, 7 captains who thought they were safe in the thermal layers, 7 families who got the same telegram my mother was terrified of getting. It's a heavy thing to think about. Dutch didn't hate the Germans. He didn't talk about them with malice. To him, it was a technical problem. The U-boat was a variable in an equation, and his sieve was the solution. He told me that once during a quiet watch. He said, "Henry, the ocean doesn't care whose side you're on. It just wants to pull you down. The U-boats are just a part of the ocean right now. My job isn't to kill people. It's to make the ocean a little safer for you boys." It was a strange way to look at it, but it made sense to me. It took the hatred out of it and replaced it with a sense of purpose. When I was in the infantry, I tried to keep that same perspective. I wasn't there to destroy a country. I was there to clear a path so we could all go home. But to clear that path, you had to be smarter than the people who were trying to block it. And you had to be smarter than the people who were giving you the orders. After the war, when I finally saw that article about the revolutionary breakthrough in sonar, I felt a deep sense of cynicism that I've never quite been able to shake. It's the way history is written, neat and tidy, with the credit going to the people with the highest rank. They mentioned the laboratories and the research grants. They didn't mention the chief petty officer who'd been bolting black boxes to depth charge racks in 1943. They didn't mention the 7 ships he'd already sent to the bottom. To the Navy, those 7 kills didn't exist because they weren't achieved using authorized methods. Think about that for a second. 7 enemy submarines destroyed, and the Navy ignored them because the paperwork wasn't right. It's madness. But it's a madness we live with every day. I often wonder how many of our greatest achievements are actually just the legalized versions of things some rebel was doing years before. It makes me look at the world with a bit of a squint. I don't trust the headlines, and I don't trust the experts who say something is impossible. I just think about Dutch and his pipe and that little green screen flickering in the dark of a hurricane. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 now, and my house is full of things I've fixed over the years. My lawnmower is 20 years old and has parts from 3 different brands on it. My toaster doesn't have a handle anymore. I use a wooden peg I carved myself. My kids tell me I should just buy new things, that it's not worth the effort to keep the old stuff running. They don't understand. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. It's about knowing how the thing works and making it better than the factory intended. It's about being the master of your own tools. Every time I pick up a wrench, I feel a little bit of Dutch Miller standing over my shoulder. I feel that same stubborn pride in doing things the wrong way because the wrong way is the only way that actually works. I hope that when I'm gone, someone finds my old toolbox and realizes that it wasn't just a collection of metal. It was a testament to a way of life. A life that started on a troop ship in the middle of a war, watching a man prove that one person with a good idea is worth more than 1,000 people with a manual. I'm finishing this story now because I can feel the fog starting to roll in for me too. My mind isn't as sharp as it was, and the memories are starting to blend together like colors in a rainstorm. But Dutch is still there. That black box is still there. 7 U-boats are still at the bottom of the ocean, and the Navy still hasn't said thank you. But I'm saying it. Thank you, Dutch. Thank you for the SEV. Thank you for showing a 19-year-old kid that the signal is always there if you just have the guts to tune it in. I made it home because of you, and I've lived a long, full life because of that lesson you taught me on the deck of the Mulaney. The rules are for the people who are afraid to fail. The mods are for the people who are determined to succeed. I know which side I'd rather be on.